Thank you, Alyssa. Okay, so today I'm going to show you about dashboards, how they work, how to pull out repeating data from a SharePoint site, the dashboard types, and some other techniques that we use. To start off, dashboards provide an at-a-glance views of KPIs, or rather, it's a real-time user interface showing a presentation of the current status of a particular objective or a business process like sales, marketing, or productions. And the data presented consists of repeating tables. So how do we show that information? We'll be discussing that later on. Aside from that, we will also be tackling about InfoPath as a web page editor. This is actually an InfoPath form which looks like a web page. And then next topic is creating an overlay. Well, overlays often appear on web pages when you click on something and then a pop-up appears, which seems to be floating from the page. Yes, that is possible with InfoPath. On with the dashboard. So using this type of dashboard requires no code. It is out of the box and it's easy to deploy. The repeating data can be displayed. It has an easy to calculate metrics, which gives us insight and more informed decision making for better results. But before we take a look at our dashboard, let's first try to submit data onto a SharePoint site. Okay, so I'll just be using some random data here. Lunch meeting with clients. Done. Okay. Meals for $30. And let's add another one. Let's say for a taxi fare, transportation, $5. And let's submit the data. Okay, so for this expense report, without using Q rules when we sent it, we mapped the form in the library to the SharePoint using Camel, which is this one. Well, this topic has been previously discussed during the tasks webinar, sometime January of this year. Okay, so now let's go on to the data that we have sent. Here, we're going to see the new entry we've just added, which is this one. So this example is a basic one. So how did we pull this repeating data from SharePoint? First, we need to have the data connections. So I'll show you the dashboard. This is just a regular SharePoint connection. One connection is from a library, which is this one, which is the parent table, and the other table is a child, which is from the SharePoint list, or the header section, or sorry, the child section. Okay, so this is the header section, or the parent table, which resides inside the child table, or the repeating section. Okay, so let's recheck the sections. This is the repeating table, And this is the child table. The header is inside the repeating table, or the section from the secondary data source, which is this one. And we've just dragged the fields inside the repeating group onto the repeating section. So this technique does not require code. It's out of the box and easy to deploy. Just like this one. Okay, so let's proceed to the next dashboard example. Here, we've added a functionality which allows us to search for items within the SharePoint list. To filter the search, we had to use a series of strings and the form logic. Actually, we can also do this for the previous dashboard we've used, but it will require a different set of rules. Now, this dashboard is a bit more complex. It also has a father and child relationship. This one, and this would be the child. It has the ability to query a current user to put limitations on the query data for the search. It uses a REST web service at the data connections. And it has multiple layers of grouping or nesting, as you can see. And also, it uses an OData service to do a complex query for multiple lists. So we had to use Q rules for this dashboard in order to manipulate and calculate the data presented. We will be giving out these samples and documentation, so you can check it out later on. Another thing, well, this is not part of the topic, but there's also another scenario wherein, let's say, you have tens of thousands of rows or something like that. And it goes way beyond the limit of SharePoint storage. The most scalable solution is to use a database, and we can use a BCS or a web service to pull data for that. But if you don't want to create your own web service, you can use QueryDB. You can download our free web service trial for that. We also have another example which shows what we can do with InfoPath. Here, the interesting part about this is that they can handle images, which has been submitted via forms. And here's another one. This is actually a dashboard. Another great thing about InfoPath is that it can be used as a web page editor. We can build interactive web pages without writing code. And these dashboards are an example of that. So let's discuss InfoPath as a web page editor. To use InfoPath as a web page editor, you need to add InfoPath as a web part to your page. Users can directly modify the content, appearance, and behavior of a SharePoint site by using a browser. To create one, let's proceed to the SharePoint library and look for Site Actions and click on Edit Page. Often, when we make a dashboard, we publish it to a library. Then we modify the page to hide the built-in list web part and instead show it an InfoPath form web part with the form in it, which is the dashboard. Okay, so we have this tiny inverted triangle which allows us to edit the page. Click on it and click on the Edit Web part. And at the right side, a task pane will pop up, and this is like the editing section of the page. Here we can hide the library, which is this one, at the Advanced section. Just tick the box, or Layout section rather. Let's just tick the box to have this hidden. And now let's add the web part. Add a web part and select Forms, InfoPath Form web part, and click Add. Okay, then select the form, which is the dashboard in this case, and select that here. Then click OK. So that will become the web page, or the web part. Next, let's discuss about creating overlays. To create an overlay is like it's like performing a magical illusion. I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so this is the page. When you click a button, it will bring us here. You might think that this is impossible on InfoPath, but there is a way to do it. The trick here, which I will show you, is to create another page, a page design. Okay, so let's name this page. Okay, so let's delete this one and copy the main page. Control A, copy. Post everything here. Okay, so this is where the magic happens when we click a button. Okay, so it's this button. It's easy to add. Simply create another section on top of the previous page, which is this one, and put a shading using the tools we have on the Layout tab. Here, pick a color, and here we can create that illusion I was talking about. So this is easy to add. Simply create another section on top of the previous page, put a shading using the tools, and there we go. This looks like a pop-up and improves user perception. This was recently covered, the overlay, in a blog post, so feel free to check it out. So that's it for overlaying. I'll be passing the mic to Jimmy now to discuss performance issues in browser publishing.
Thank you very much, Don. Just give me a moment to show my screen. Okay, now today I'd like to talk about performance in when it pertains to browser publishing your InfoPath Forms to a SharePoint server. We've recently run into a number of issues with publishing, and it's given us some great experience to find ways to better troubleshoot these issues, and I'd like to share that information with you. Now, a great tool to use when troubleshooting publishing issues is Fiddler. And for those of you who don't know, Fiddler is a tool that allows you to see what's going on behind the scenes in between your programs and the outside world, the web. In particular, when you publish a form to SharePoint, InfoPath sends a whole lot of requests to SharePoint, and in particular, a very important one is one that comes towards the ends of the process, which is a call to a web method called Browser Enable User Form Template. Now, this is what will decide whether you're generally what will decide whether your publishing succeeds or not. And often, if you inspect this request in Fiddler, it can often give you, more information about what the SharePoint server is saying than InfoPath will sometimes tell you. Another thing you can see here is that this server think time column is telling us that the request took 1 minute and 31 seconds, and that's also going to be important for diagnosing publishing issues. So in order to watch the whole process in Fiddler, well, first you need to download and install it. It's a free tool. You can get it at fiddler2.com. You would start it. You would make sure that the server think time column is showing. Then start your publishing from InfoPath and wait for it to either finish, or towards the end it will stop for a while on that browser enable form template step, because it usually takes about 20 seconds or more. So just wait for that to finish. You can use Control F to find that step. I've just put the text browser enable because you don't need to type in the whole thing. And that should generally take you to that request where you can inspect what's going on. Now, this browser enable user form template step, as I'll mention later, by default, SharePoint, when you're publishing a form to the Sandbox, when it's got code in it or it's got QROs in it, SharePoint will only allow that to run by 30 seconds by default. So it's usually a good idea to keep that time as low as possible, so you can keep the timeouts as low as possible on your SharePoint machine. I mean, those timeouts are there for a reason, and it's generally good to avoid increasing them unless you really have to. So typically, you want to try to keep your form publishing in 20 seconds or less, so you're not bumping up against that limit. If you have to, you can increase it, and I'll talk about that later, but you want to keep it generally around a minute if you can. And then if it's starting to take 4 minutes or more, then you know things are starting to get troublesome, and you should probably really look at redesigning your form to publish faster. Now, what are some things that cause timeout issues in publishing? One issue we encountered a while ago was a form that had a very large view. Here on the screen you can see some screenshots. This is actually a single view that goes on for about 10 screen lengths in InfoPath Designer, and we actually had one more view in the same form that was approximately the same size. What we found was that when we tried to publish this form, it was taking up to 10 minutes to publish, and even though the timeout had been increased to 10 minutes, it was reaching that timeout. So what we did was we split it up into smaller views, and this allowed it to publish significantly faster. One way to see, to look at how large views are, aside from just looking at them in Designer, is to look at their source files. Now, for those of you who don't know, InfoPath templates are actually made up of a bunch of files that are compressed into the XSN file. You can actually extract these by going to File, then Publish, and then Extract Source Files to look at them. And looking at the size of the files will generally tell you, give you some idea about what's going on. So we can see the manifest here is very large. It's over a megabyte. This large view I was talking about in the previous slide, that was 720 KB. It was actually 10,000 lines of code. So when you start seeing file sizes for the view files and for the manifest files, you know that's somewhat troublesome. Another potential issue that we recently ran up against is heavily nested sections. Section controls can be useful for showing and hiding things in your form, but we found that when they're nested really deep, this can actually introduce a lot of complexity into the view and make them hard to process during the publishing process. We also found that even InfoPath Designer was having a little trouble with this, and taking up to 10 seconds to load it when we switch to it from another view in the designer. So you want to avoid nesting your sections too deep. This actually has them nested about 9 levels deep. But not all of these layers are really needed. So to sum up a bit, to improve your publishing performance, you should avoid huge views, split the large views up into smaller ones, or you could even have a view that combines smaller views and then have a main view that goes to that, as long as they're not too big. You should try to keep them within about 3 to 4 screen lengths within the designer. Also avoid heavily nested section controls. You use, of course there'll be times where you need to use sections, but don't overuse them. Don't use them if you don't have to. And consider splitting your view up into smaller views if you find the nesting gets really deep. I think 6 levels of nesting is probably a good guideline for this. And of course, in general, it's good to avoid large forms. If you've got tons and tons of views, or you're storing tons of data in your form, that might be an indicator that you should split the form up into multiple forms and separate the data out into separate components. Of course, I've been talking about performance from the publishing angle and how it can prevent your form from publishing, but following these same guidelines will also help the form to run better in the browser when people are actually filling it out. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you can watch the publishing process, see what it's doing using the free tool Fiddler. Now, as I alluded to earlier, by default, SharePoint only allows Sandbox Operations to run for 30 seconds. What's a Sandbox operation, you might ask? Well, SharePoint provides this concept called a sandbox, which allows people to publish code to SharePoint without going through an administrator. But in order to prevent this code from doing bad things, they put certain limits on it, and then by default, they only allow a single sandbox operation to run for 30 seconds, and that includes this browser enable user form template step. Now, if you find that 30 seconds is not enough for your form, and you've done everything you can to optimize the form, you can increase this timeout limit by well, an administrator can by running a script on the SharePoint server. We're providing this script with our package this week. It's a PowerShell script. So you would log into the server. You can modify the script to set the timeouts that you want. And the script that we're providing has them set to 10 minutes. Then the script would be run in the SharePoint management shell, and then you would need to restart the SharePoint user code host, also known as the Sandbox service, for those changes to take effect. As a side note, another browser publishing thing we ran into recently is that people pickers should not be placed inside of section controls that are bound to a secondary data source. Even if the section directly around it is bound to the main data source, if any section going outward containing that people picker or section around it is bound to a secondary data source, then you will run into errors trying to use the form in the browser. It won't prevent the publishing, but when you try to open the form, you'll see this non-specific error, and there won't even be a correlation ID with it. So please be careful about that. I'd like to thank you all for attending. Please send us your feedback, and when you send that, we will provide you with today's presentation slides and also our demo files and scripts. So we'd like to now open up the floor for questioning. Now, we have and Don's a first-time presenter. So Don, have a look at the questions pane, and you can see the questions coming in and chime in with your answers. So we have a question: with DBXL, can you connect to multiple databases and create multiple forms with one license, or would I have to purchase a license for each database connection? Yes, I don't know the specifics, but the DBXL license will generally allow you to connect to several databases, probably around 3 to 5. And then you can increase your license size incrementally to support additional databases. We have another question for Don. In the job application demo, how did you round the corners of the light blue pop-up window? I can field this. This is done with the use of images. You can just place an image into the form with the rounded corners. You can generally create these using Photoshop or similar image manipulation tools. We have a blog post that was recently posted on Qdabra.com that goes into more detail about creating these overlays, so I recommend checking that out. We have another question: is there an XCP that replaces the Camel method with Q rules? We do have certain XCPs that use Camel. We have one for submitting tasks. Of course, Camel, it generally has to be written, well, you have to put it together manually. So there isn't, I'm not sure that there's so much logic that can be put in an XCP that could be flexible for different types of Camel, but or I mean for different sets of columns. But there are, we do have certain XCPs that work with Camel. We have another question. How can you add buttons or tabs at the top to switch views for the user? This is built-in InfoPath functionality. You can just place buttons at the top of your form, and on the button you can place a rule action to switch the view to whatever view you want. And then you can create a consistent layout by copying your layout to several views, so you can have the same set of buttons at the top of each view. Next question: is there a technique that you would suggest if you need to split a single form into many forms for performance reasons? Would you suggest displaying the forms using the InfoPath web parts to display more than a single form? Other suggestions? Typically, I'm not sure if there's a single best technique for this, but the concept is to have a one form for each type of data that you want to display, and you can pass data in between forms by using input parameters. Now, input parameters are basically values you include in a URL. So you can have a URL that opens up another form using its browser URL, and then include a couple values in that URL. You can then use Q rules to pull out those values. There's also the ability to pass values between web parts. This is specified in the form properties. This isn't a technique that we've tried a lot, but I would definitely recommend trying it out and letting us know how it goes. We have another question: would this work on SharePoint 2007? I believe that the InfoPath web part was introduced in SharePoint 2010, but of course you can browser publish a form to SharePoint 2007 and then just have a dashboard that opens up as an ordinary InfoPath form, certainly. The next question, using Q rules in such a form affect the browser-enabled form publishing in addition to the mentioned issues? Generally, no, I wouldn't say that it affects the performance a lot. The big change is that having any sort of code in your form will cause it to be either published as a sandbox form, or you can admin publish it. So there's a slightly higher bar there, and that's what you need to look out for. But I would not say that it significantly degrades the publishing performance. Will a large list as a secondary data connection affect InfoPath performance? Certainly, querying large quantities of data will slow down your form, so we recommend filtering your data. In InfoPath 2010, the ordinary list connections allow you to filter data by indicating certain values that should be in the values returned, and I recommend checking that out. There are also other options for querying data, such as the OData service, the REST OData service. It's also in SharePoint 2010. And there's the OSSVR service as well, which is similar. OData will give you the largest control over your filtering and let you do complex filters. We also provide a query SharePoint service with our DBXL package that allows you to construct fairly complex queries. Can bar charts be included on an InfoPath dashboard? That's a very good question. I'm not sure we've ever tried that before. Generally, there aren't ways to dynamically control the width of controls, but I imagine you could have an expression box with a bunch of spaces in it and a certain background color. And you could use a slightly tricky XPath formula to determine the length of that string. That would probably allow you to get a variable-sized box of some degree. Okay, so that looks like that's our last question. One new question, has Qdabra ever created a solution that used InfoPath and BMC's Remedy Web Service to create help desk tickets based on data within the form? No, not that I know of. I'm not familiar with BMC Remedy's Web Service, but by all means, please get in touch with us if you're interested in that, and we can share any knowledge we have with you. Okay, so that looks like that is the last question. So I'd like to thank you all for attending. Hope you'll be back next week, and please remember to fill out your feedback. Bye for now.